Welcome into another edition of the Musketeer Report Podcast. Today is Monday, December 23rd. Xavier is ranked 57th in KenPom, which is actually an improvement from their low point of the season after the TCU game when they were ranked 65th. They lost the last two games since we spoke, 94-89 in overtime at UConn and 72-70 at home to Marquette. They have a 9-day break coming up in between that game against Marquette and their next game when they host Seton Hall on New Year's Eve. We'll start by taking a look at the big picture as we typically do. For me, and I'm just right now weighing the fact that this team has lost 3 straight games, 5 out of their last 7. They're sitting with an 8-5 record, no signature wins, and they have a roster that is deeply flawed at this point, certainly without Zach Freemantle. With the fact that they just played probably their 2 toughest games, or at least not the 2 toughest games. They played against the 2 toughest opponents that they'll face in conference play, and they were right there with chances to win it at the end of both games. I realize the moral victories aren't what anyone's looking for right now, and that's not really what I'm suggesting here, but I do think there's something there. It is kind of difficult to just go all in on this team stinks, they're playing terribly, this is a disaster, when you lose your best player in Zach Freemantle, and the next 2 games, you're right there with chances to win both of them at the end of the game. And yes, you let them slip away. And yes, that's frustrating. We'll talk more about those situations. But there's something there, right? There's a little bit of optimism or hope or something that you want to believe in with this group, I think, based on those 2 results. And I think those last 2 games felt different to me. XU played above their level in the UConn game. The shot making in that game was ridiculous. The 3-point shooting, that hasn't been common for this group. Dante Maddox coming off the bench, playing the way he did, giving them over 20 points. That was a really big boost. So in a way, that game to me felt kind of like Xavier was playing above their level. And then UConn, which was the better team, eventually won out with their size and their ability to just kind of overwhelm Xavier at the end of that game. Yes, Xavier made some mistakes, but I felt like that was more indicative of the way that game probably should have gone more often. Xavier kind of bailed themselves out throughout that game by making some really impressive shots. The second game against Marquette, it felt like Xavier got Marquette on a good day. That's a team that they match up pretty well against. Marquette was, Cam Jones, their best player, didn't have his best shooting day. Yeah, he got 20 points, but it came on 20 shots, I believe. The problem with Xavier was pretty blah for most of the game outside of that 5 or 6 minute stretch late in the second half where they reeled off 14 straight. But to me, that felt more like Marquette got cold. They missed 5 shots. They had a turnover. They have 6 or 7 empty possessions. And then Xavier all of a sudden is back in the game because they're scoring on the other end, getting some transition opportunities. Those 2 games, those results, the way those unfolded, those felt a little different to me. It felt like Xavier played poorly in the Marquette game, didn't give themselves some of the chances that they should have, and then really screwed up at the end of that one, where the UConn game, it felt all along like they were kind of doing better than they should have been. And then, yes, it didn't play out in their favor, but that I kind of looked like the way the game was going to go for a lot of it, in my opinion, and somehow they were able to avoid that by making a lot of good plays. In terms of these end-of-game mistakes, which is clearly becoming a theme for this team, and it's mostly turnovers when we're talking about mistakes, it seems like it's always guys giving the ball away that's costing them more than anything. There have been some defensive lapses, especially earlier in the season, like the TCU game. I can remember they fouled a 3-point shooter, terrible mental mistake there. But a lot of times it's coming down to turnovers on the offensive end or really bad possessions on the offensive end. And I think they mostly stem from guys pressing when they can't generate separation and get good ball movement in these late game situations where the other team has turned up the pressure and is really locked in. It feels like if Shawn Miller isn't orchestrating each and every step for this team with a perfect set play, they have trouble making things happen in the big moments. Almost 65% of this team's field goals are assisted. That's how they score their points. You could say that's a good thing, and it is. It's good that they have good ball movement and they pass it well, but I think it also speaks to the reason that they rank so highly in that statistic is because they're not able to score their points in other ways. They're not having guys go one-on-one and score in isolation. They're not able to throw it into the post and let their big man go get a bucket for them right now. So they are having to find ways to get good ball movement and get open jump shots. And when teams are able to take that away from them, especially in these late game situations, I think that's where we see them start to press, and then they dribble into a double team inexplicably, like Davion McKnight or Dalen Swain did against Marquette. These are the things that they need to clean up. And the reason that it feels tough to fix, in my opinion, right now is because I don't know what the answer is, who you go to in those late game situations. How do you create more separation aside from Shawn Miller just drawing up set play after set play, which he's doing pretty well? I mean, when he draws up a set play, they are getting some open looks and they've been able to execute, and they've had some great moments off of that. But like even going back to the Cincinnati game, you have to run a set to get Zach Freemantle the end of game shot for a three, because you don't really trust that Ryan Conwell or one of your other shooters can generate some separation and get an open look. So I think that's part of what they're dealing with. The lack of athleticism, the lack of playmaking by their guards is a real problem for them in these moments. In terms of bright spots, I think Marcus Foster has definitely stood out to me. 5 of 12 from the field in each of the last 2 games. He hit 3 3-pointers in each of those games. He's been guarding the opposing team's best player a lot. I think he's taken a step forward. I don't know if he can be your go-to guy in end of game moments. I don't know if he can be your go-to guy, period, but he seems like a really good sidekick right now, a guy that can give you that 10 to 15 points a game on a more consistent basis while also playing really good defense and rebounding some. So I think Marcus Foster, definitely a bright spot since Zach Freemantle went down. Ryan Conwell, the thing about him is this team is not going to survive bad performances by him. He was good at UConn, but then when he struggled against Marquette with just 7 points on 3 of 10 shooting and was 1 of 6 from 3-point range with 3 turnovers, the team looked really dysfunctional for a lot of the game on offense. And I think that's what we're going to see more often than not this year. It's a heavy burden for him. It's a similar burden that Quincy Oliveri had on his shoulders last year, although you could argue at times he had a guy who was able to take some of that off of his plate with Desmond Claude's ability to create plays off the dribble. Ryan Conwell sort of being asked to play both of those roles for this team right now. He doesn't have a guy who's capable of breaking down defenders, winning one-on-one matchups as much off the bounce, so he's often being put in those spots. He's also being put in the spot of the team's best scorer and shooter like Quincy was last year and run a lot of those sets for him, have him fly off screens and try to get open 3-point shots. So there's a lot of pressure on Ryan Conwell, there's no doubt. But it's also clear that this team is not going to survive games where he doesn't play well. And then you go to Dante Maddox. And what happened to him, right? You play 35 minutes against UConn, 22 points, 5 3-pointers, breakout game, and it feels like, okay, maybe this team, that's what they were really lacking more than anything, was that extra firepower on the perimeter that we had always expected to be the signature of this team. Ryan Conwell, Dante Maddox Jr., Davion McKnight, throw in a Marcus Foster, a Dalen Swain with them, making plays and making shots at that forward position, and maybe you'd really have something that's difficult to match up with. And that just never came to fruition. And a part of that was because, Trey Green, Dante Maddox never really got it going this year. You see that performance against UConn, Dante Maddox goes for 22, and they're right there with a chance to win the game. And you're thinking, man, maybe that's the missing piece. But then we go right back to 3 points on 1 for 4 shooting in 22 minutes against Marquette. But he did it in arguably the hardest road game that Xavier will play all year. I mean, if you can do it at UConn, the defending national champs, that says something. He's the guy, I think, for this team. He's the guy with that upside. Marcus Foster has obviously shown what he's shown and stepped it up, become more consistent on the offensive end. And I think we still all hope that Dalen Swain can give you more on that end as well. There's definitely upside there. For Dalen, it's more of an all-around impact, I think, the rebounding, the defense, in addition to the scoring. But for this team right now, it feels like Dante Maddox is really the guy that has the ability to make that jump into that 10 to 15 points per game on a consistent basis, similar to what we were talking about with Marcus Foster, and give them a big lift with what they're missing from Zach Freemantle. We'll see if that happens going forward, but coming out of the break, that's something that I'm definitely going to be watching closely is, can Dante Maddox return to that UConn form? And if you can do it at UConn, it would seem that you can do it in other games. It's just a matter of finding some type of consistency. And of course, we're going to bring Paul Fritschner in here in a second, but of course, a lot of people are still asking me about the NCAA tournament and whether or not I think Xavier has a chance. I would tell you, I'm not sure how closely I'd be tracking their resume the rest of the way, because it's pretty simple for Xavier now. If they're going to be in the conversation, they need to go, let's say they have 18 games left. They need to go at least 12-6 the rest of the way to be in the conversation. So if they're going 12-6 the rest of the way, we're going to know. It's going to be obvious. They're going to be racking up wins, and we're going to be talking about it. And if they're back in the conversation, we'll start tracking the resume closer and worrying about, quad 1, quad 2, all that stuff. But right now, I don't think there's a lot of use in freaking out over what they do in the next game or two based on their resume. I think you really worry more about what this team is going to look like by the end of the season. And will they have a chance to be dangerous when you get to Madison Square Garden playing in the Big East tournament? Because you can still play your way into the NCAA tournament by winning your conference tournament. And I also think that this year in the Big East, while there are some very good teams, it doesn't feel like the top of the conference is maybe as top-heavy as it's been in the past. Yes, UConn is really good. Yes, Marquette is really good. I would argue that last year's UConn team beats either of them by 10 to 15 points. So it just feels like there might be more chance for parity when you get to the conference tournament time anyway. Might be more of a path for Xavier to make that run, especially given what they just showed against UConn and Marquette. More than anything, though, after that press conference against Marquette, I think this group needs a reset. Shawn Miller looked like a man who was just fed up, who was done, who had maybe lost some of the belief in this group for the moment. I mean, that one quote where he kind of said, we just have to do the best we can when we get back. It's not about looking for positives. That sounded like a guy who had lost a lot of hope in this group and had really seen things go against his team for an extended stretch here. And so I guess that's where we'll leave it. Let's bring Paul Fritschner in to talk more about it. But I just think the big takeaway there after the Marquette game was Shawn Miller needs a mental refresh. He needs a reset. I think this break for his team comes at a great time for him personally. And, we'll see what he comes back with the second half of the year. I thought his coaching staff coached two pretty good games to have them in the UConn and Marquette games with a chance to win them. But it's a difficult road ahead to find any wins in this Big East schedule as long as Zach Freemantle's out. Which, by the way, we did post a little bit of an update there on the Musketeer Report message board. Not a lot to confirm there just yet, but I do think we'll have more news to come. So check out the update on Zach Freemantle at Musketeer Report, and let's bring in Paul Fritschner to talk more about what he's seen from the team over the last few games. All right, Paul Fritschner now joining me to talk a little bit more about what's going on with this Xavier team. And Paul, we'll start with kind of the interesting situation that unfolded after that Marquette game in the press conference, where I think you were the only one kind of available there to answer questions. And Shawn Miller came in just a tough mood. Take me through kind of the vibes in that press conference, not so much during the questions, because we all heard that and saw that, but like, what was it like after he left, and what was the conversation like in there?
Yeah, I mean, he was clearly very frustrated. He walked in. Generally, the head coach will take about, I would say, 25 minutes to a half hour after the press conference or after the game's over to get into the press conference, because they have to go and, maybe they're doing the post game on TV, or maybe they're doing after a win, or maybe they're doing, Joe and Byron talking to the team, whatever they got to do. But usually I walk in there pretty quickly after the game and start to get set up. I mean, obviously being down there and doing my MC work, I miss some things as far as the box score goes. So I'll take those few minutes to read the box score, get caught up, check Twitter. Maybe there were things that I missed that would be nice to ask about or talk to other people about while you're in the room. But
then usually we hear from the players first.
Yeah. Usually, generally, you hear from the players first, and Shawn walked in before the writers were even down into the room, and I was the only one in there at that point. So I didn't even have time at that point. I mean, again, this was probably 5 or 6 minutes after the game was over, and I hadn't even had the chance to pull up the box score yet on my phone. So I did the best I could, asked 3 pretty general questions just to give him the opportunity to speak whatever was on his mind. But I could tell at that point, having asked him hundreds of questions over the last 2 years, that I could tell that there was a lot on his mind. There was a lot of frustration, and it was the shortest press conference that I've ever seen him give. Generally, his opening statement is over 4 or 5 minutes, and he didn't give an opening statement. He just asked for questions, and by that time, Shelby and Mike Petralia came in and asked the last two. But yeah, I just think the media room was packed outside of with photographers and videographers and everything in the back of the room, but the front of the room was definitely you could sense the frustration, and I think it's very valid, all the frustration that had built up and the way that the game ended. And he didn't comment on whether he thought it was a foul or not on Ryan Conwell, and I don't think that I'm not sure how much would have been gained by him commenting on, unless he just totally went off on the officiating, but he kind of did that rant last year. So
yeah,
I'm not really sure how much there would have been to gain from him going off on if he thought that was a foul or not. I think everybody that watched the play could judge that for themselves.
I mean, we all agree it was a foul, right? Like you saw it live.
Yeah.
We all saw the video replay. It was a foul, correct?
Yeah. And Ryan Conwell, then he would have had to go to the line and hit both free throws. So there is that element of it too. It's, he would have had to go to the line and hit both free throws to send the game into overtime. But yeah, you could definitely sense the frustration. It was the shortest press conference I've ever seen or heard him give. And, now they have a break. And I think that was the most poignant thing that he said in that press conference was just, we need a break. He said that, I think, word for word there, that he just said, we need a break. And now they have 10 days in between games to when they play a pretty broken Seton Hall team on December 31st that just lost last night in an excruciating way at home to Georgetown. First time Georgetown beat Seton Hall at the Prudential Center in 10 years. And, that's a game where you try to get right there on New Year's Eve. So I don't think this break could have possibly come at a better time for Xavier after a grueling week against Cincinnati, UConn, and Marquette, all 3 games where you led in the final 8 minutes and weren't able to close things out. Now, I know UConn and Marquette, it's a little different than when you're at Cincinnati and you're up 7 and you really truly feel like you're going to win that game. Whereas, UConn and Marquette, it's maybe a 1-point lead or you're back and forth. And yeah, you didn't close it out and some turnovers cost you, but it wasn't like you were up 10 against Marquette and up 10 against UConn. It was a little different the way it played out, but still all very winnable there at the end of the game. And yeah, I think the players being able to go home, regroup, Shawn going to be able to regroup here and kind of figure out how things go forward from here. I think this break comes at a great time.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was talking about right before I brought you on to the show, was just this team needs a mental reset right now. Shawn clearly needs it after that press conference. I think just the way he looked, the way he was talking in that press conference seemed like he just needs some time away from this group and some time to regroup. You are around the team as much as anyone with the documentary work and stuff you guys are doing. Do you get that sense from the players too, that everyone just kind of needs a break from it right now?
I mean, to be honest, Rick, I thought the vibes around at least at practice through the week, and I'll be honest, I wasn't there every second of every practice through the week. I was there for the last, I would say, half of a couple of the practices leading into it, but the vibes I got were pretty good. I mean, they were very encouraged after. I know there's no moral victories, but to go down to the wire like that against UConn, I think the vibes were pretty good going in. It wasn't like, Zach went down and it felt to me like the season was shot or anything. I think the players rallied around the fact that they had a very good performance at UConn and then came back and kind of it didn't pan out in the end of the first half and the beginning of the second half until they ripped off that 14-0 run there to close the Marquette game. I wouldn't necessarily say that I get any kind of a vibe there that they just are so frustrated that they need to be away from each other at all. I think that it was a tough week, though, and I didn't get a chance to talk to anybody after the Marquette game. Everybody kind of dispersed for Christmas break, so I guess I can't speak to it after Marquette. But as far as what happened through the week, I thought the vibes were pretty good, and we're pushing for a win there on Saturday, obviously.
Yeah, and I mean, their performances would suggest that. Like, you have to give them credit for the 2 performances against UConn and Marquette in terms of showing up, being able to shake off whatever's happened, whether it be the Zach Fremantle news, the tough loss to Cincinnati, or then the tough loss at UConn in overtime. They were able to turn the page in both occasions and seemingly, perform. They showed up and were in the game, gave themselves a chance in late game situations. And then obviously we know how those played out, and we've talked about that a ton recently. Paul, you are the eternal optimist of this show when it comes to Xavier basketball. So what's one positive that you take away from these last two games that you look to as a Xavier fan that you think maybe going forward can be a nice boost?
Well, look, nobody wants to hear that you were in the game and lost. There's no two ways about it. At some point, you have to win games. And the fact that Xavier hasn't won a high major game since that game against South Carolina, it'll be over a month by the time that you play Seton Hall on New Year's Eve. But when you lose your leading scorer, there's a very real world where you go up to Hartford and the same performance that happened last year happens again. And I think the game against Hartford, the game against UConn in Hartford, I thought that was one of the most fun, just purely watching that game. Xavier, the offensive sets that Xavier ran.
Well, the shot making was fantastic.
Shot making was fantastic. I mean, just so many elements of that game. The offense that we saw that we had kind of been waiting to see for so long. It reminded me of what we keep going back to on this show, Rick. How many times? It's like, that's kind of more what we saw in Dayton than what we've seen so far this season. That UConn game was a whole lot more reminiscent of that than anything that we had seen so far outside of, sure, the Morgan State game. But I was wondering what would happen on Saturday. Is the game against UConn such an emotional drain that you left it all out there? Dante Maddox gives you 22 points. You guys shoot out of your minds, over 50% from three. You take them to overtime, and you still can't win. Do you come out on Saturday totally flat and it doesn't look great? For a while, they looked flat, but then they get off the mat, they rally, rip off a 14-0 run, and take the lead in the final 3 minutes of the game. Just weren't able to close it out. And again, it's the late turnovers. And that's where I would say to myself, I know there's a big enough sample size that you could say that it might be a consistent problem going forward. But to me, if they keep getting down into these situations, at some point you have to think these guys will figure it out closing the game. There's something in there to me that these guys can figure it out if they get into these situations again, but it has also happened 4 times now in the last 5 games. So maybe there is a sample size there to suggest otherwise.
Yeah, but look, I mean, there are a multitude of issues with this team right now. It is deeply flawed. And if you're going to look at the issues they have, it's like, well, I hope the one where the end of game situations, that issue keeps showing up, because at least it means they're in these games, right? It could very easily be a situation where the fact that they don't have a center prohibits them from even being close against UConn or against Marquette. So, I mean, I think there is some legitimate positives to take away from the fact that they were in these games, but I completely understand the fans who don't want to hear that right now and do not want to hear anything about a moral victory when you've lost multiple games in a row, 5 of your last 7, and they keep happening in frustrating fashion. I totally get that. And I'm not saying those aren't issues, because they are issues, and I'm not sure if there's a clear solution for them with this group. And that's one of the other disheartening things, because when you talk to Shawn Miller after that game, he didn't sound like he felt there were a lot of solutions, at least in that moment when he was deeply frustrated.
Yeah, and now here going forward, you have a very winnable 5-game stretch here for Xavier. Well, let me ask you this, Rick. Do you think the season is going to be defined by the next 5 games?
Quite honestly, no. And let me tell you why. I was just talking a little bit about this too before you came on. Personally, as a person covering the team right now, I'm not going to be tracking Xavier's NCAA tournament resume going forward much. Like, if they get there, we'll know. They'll reel off a bunch of wins in a row and they'll be in play for an NCAA tournament bid. We'll know. But realistically, with the roster they have right now, it's probably not going to happen. And that large bid, them winning 13 games in conference play the rest of the way after losing their first 2, is going to be a really heavy lift for this team. But what I think a lot of people forget about now that they've been in the Big East for this long is the NCAA tournament is special. You always have that conference tournament at the end of the year. This becomes like a mid-major situation for Xavier, right? It's like the way into the big dance is you hope your team gets hot at the right time and is playing its best basketball. And I do think, based on what we've seen the last few games, this is a team that has some legitimate upside to get excited about. If they start hitting shots like they did at UConn in a tournament situation at the end of the year, nobody wants to play this Xavier team. If you've got 3 or 4 guys hitting threes at a high clip at the end, if it's the team that we thought they could be in the summer, all of a sudden right at the end of the year, and trust me, I know there are fans rolling their eyes as they're driving right now, hearing me say that, saying, really, you think they're going to be that team when they haven't shown that at all this season? Well, maybe not. But if I'm a fan, that's what I'm hoping for. That's what I'm tracking more than anything the rest of the way. It's not so much, is the next 4 games going to define the season? Am I going to flip out if they go 2-2 over the next 4 games because their resume isn't good enough now? The resume already isn't good enough, guys. It's pretty improbable that it's going to be good enough this season based on the guys that they have left to play. So I think that's where I look more towards it, is like, can this team find some real improvement, find some type of style that works for it to where they could be real dangerous at the end of the year?
Yeah, win the games that you're supposed to win. And then, like you said, I don't know if it was on your last podcast or when you said it, but it might have been on the Spaces. You made a point where somebody asked you about what you could look forward to with Xavier the rest of this season. And I'm sitting there going, man, there's so much untapped potential right now on this team as far as the shot making and everything goes that we haven't seen yet pan out that I feel like is still in there. And you made the point, and this was before the UConn game, that we are going to see cool things happen. There are going to be moments to look forward to this season. There are going to be big things that go down over the next 3 months that we'll look back and say, okay, that happened. And it almost happened right away, boom, against UConn. And even to an extent, I would say, I mean, just watching that game back and forth and the way it went down, I know, again, maybe it's like the Kansas State game where it was a great game and there was so much that happened in it, but Xavier didn't come out on top. But I do think that this team, this is a more talented team than last year, to where cool things will happen the rest of this year. And I fully agree with you on that there are moments left in this team. And who knows, maybe there are enough moments left in this team to really make something of the season.
Well, and when I talk about cool moments, I think back to last year's team. Like, that team felt like it was dead in the water. And then Quincy scores 40 in a game, and we talk about that for a week. Or the Chick-fil-A sensation takes over and he's serving up chicken nuggets at Chick-fil-A. Like, there's just, the college basketball season brings about these things that we all enjoy and we have fun with on social media. So it's not going to be like a completely lost season from that perspective or anything. We'll still have plenty to talk about. And there is a lot to sort out with this team. And, like, especially when you talk about going forward with the roster and everything, there's a ton to look at and figure out. So there's a lot to look forward to. Paul, I'll ask you this final question here and let you go. If you could give Shawn Miller one thing for Christmas, what would that be, other than maybe a stiff drink right now?
Oh, man. And there's no games left to give him a win. Man.
Yeah, you missed the Amazon ship date on that.
Yeah, I don't know. What can I give Shawn Miller to make himself feel better right now? He loves his dog. Can I give him another toy to give his dog to just cheer him up for the week?
I mean, I guess I would have gone with a rebounding big man possibly, because that's a little unrealistic at this point.
Yeah, another ACL for Lucina.
Yeah, one of the two guys needs a new knee. That'd be nice. So
yeah.
All right, Paul, you and Lizzie, enjoy your first Christmas together. Merry Christmas to you. Thanks for all your help on today's show and throughout the year. And Happy New Year if I don't talk to you before then.
Yeah, thanks, Rick. You too. And I know we've gotten some questions about the Shawn Miller podcast, just making the schedule work with the team traveling and being out of town with UConn, and then the back-to-back with Marquette, and then now the holidays. Just bear with us on the scheduling here going into the new year. And then the next episode of All In will be after the new year. So that's a couple of things to look forward to there. And Rick, you and the fam, and Trey, you, Lindsay, Trey, everybody, enjoy the holiday. And we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Paul. All right, thanks to Paul Fritschner. Good stuff from him as always. Big picture coming out of this break again, I think if Xavier continues to get these close games, they have these end of game moments, who's going to step up for them? They need somebody, or maybe it's not somebody, but something, right? Like, I think the end of game situations for Souley Boum looked different than they did for Quincy Oliveri the following year. Xavier found different things that worked for those teams. Maybe there's still something out there that this team can find that will work in those moments for this group, because they need something that gets them out of these empty possessions where guys are dribbling into mistakes and driving into double teams and losing the ball and turning it over. That's just not going to get it done. That's brutal to watch. I know the coaching staff isn't going to continue to watch that. So they'll have to find something else coming out of that. And again, I think some of the guys that I really have my eye on coming out of this break is, what is Dante Maddox going to do? How is he going to respond going forward after what we've seen from him the last few games? We talked about that earlier. Dalen Swain, still a ton of upside there. They need more from him. I mean, the double-double is great with Marquette, but again, it's some uneven performances. They need him to be a bit more consistent. And also, there's still a lot of upside there that's yet to be tapped into. So we'll see if they can get more out of him as well. Those are the big storylines that I'm really watching coming out of this break. I hope you guys enjoy your Christmas. Have a great Christmas. If you have not subscribed yet, or you need a Christmas gift for a Xavier fan, there's still 50% off sale going on at musketeerreport.com for a few more days. So get them the gift of the Xavier basketball community this year, and then you'll have an easy gift for next year, as you can just renew that gift for them. So my family genuinely appreciates all of you who do subscribe to the site throughout the year, all year long. It means a ton to us. And so we wish you a Merry Christmas, and we will talk more about all of this Xavier stuff on the message board. Thanks, guys.